Welcome to week 2 of the Dry Bones series. I think I mentioned it last week. If you're concerned that I've been wearing the same clothes for 2 weeks, rest easy. I'm okay. I recorded it all in one day. And actually, I'm reading this live also tomorrow and flying home. So there's a good possibility that people are going to be like, man, I don't know if things are okay with Jordan. He's been wearing the same clothes a lot. I'm good. Things are fine. Started last week with the story of the dry bones. Ezekiel 37 talks about Ezekiel having this vision. God shows him this vision. And I think it's an interesting thing because it's a thought of the bones, the dry bones. Is he's getting to watch this like a movie going on in his mind or spirit or whatever. He's walking through this valley of dry bones and he's recognizing the death and what we would tag as final. The dry bones. It says that they were very dry. It goes into very detailed specifics. Very, very dead. And he's walking through the bones, and then God begins this process to start to restore these bones in the vision. Don't get too creeped out. In the vision, things start to come back together, and then God breathes life, and it's this great army. That's kind of what we talked about last week. If we were to take on the task of writing our own eulogy today, then if you were to look at the end, if you were to go to the end, if you were to go to your funeral in your mind, the vision, same as Ezekiel, this vision of what your funeral would look like. And what sorts of things would you want to be true? What would you want to be true about your life on that day where people are kind of recounting your life? What would you want to be true? And here's what's fascinating is that when you kind of snap out of that, you're like, when you're done writing the eulogy or considering it or thinking about it, you come back to life, you realize like, oh, wait a minute. I've got time between now and that moment. I've got time today. I'm back. It's like death coming back to life. I have whatever remaining amount of time I have between now and then matters. That's the only window of time that I'm going to get to make the things I want to be true. And the time and what is true today, this is the only window of time I get to work on those things. Our remaining time matters. Our life matters. Our mission of between now and then could really honestly get a lot more simple. I think life could become a lot more simple if we started living according to what would hopefully be true at our funeral. I know it's kind of dark and that's a lot to take in. I realize that. I know a lot of people that avoid their death or thinking about it. We don't think about it and it's hard. We don't want to really consider it. Jacob actually said it. He said, you can tell when someone who's aging has never really stopped and sort of grasped their own death because it's like they're trying to dress younger, act younger, look younger. They're just avoiding it at all costs, even considering that it's going to end. 3-point sermon. It's the wrap up. It's actually probably my favorite wrap up to any sermon I've ever done because I love how it ties back into last week. So if you haven't watched it, go back. I'm giving the surprise away in this sermon if you haven't heard the last one, but this is the continuation of the Ezekiel 37. 3-point sermon. It's a 3-point sermon. There are 2 different stories. There's a disciple story and there is an Old Testament story, and they're going to tie together. So let me tell you, first, if you're taking notes, if you're going to try to take what we're doing today and consider it and chew on it and apply it, if you're taking notes, 3 points, here's the first one. Take inventory of your goals. And you're like, how are you going to start breaking down the sermon? You haven't even read a scripture yet. Stick with me. It'll all tie together. Take inventory of your goals. When you start to consider what you want your life to, what things you want to be true of your life in the end, your goals will be different depending on where you start. Here's what I mean by that. If you start today and just live every day in sequential order, never giving thought to a future, your goals are going to look different than if you stop, consider the end, and start to work your way backwards. Your goals, if you were to take inventory of your goals will tell you a lot about your planning, what is going to be true of your life in the end. I think, for instance, let me give you an example. For instance, money as a primary goal is a weird one because you give it all back. He who dies with the most toys still dies. So when you start to take inventory of your goals, this is where I want to go to the word because it's a perfect example of if you know that the end, if you've considered the end and worked your way back versus starting today. Luke chapter 22, verse 31. Simon, Simon, this is Jesus talking to Peter. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I've prayed for you, Simon, that you may not fail. This is Jesus talking to a very confident Peter. Simon, Peter says, pray that you may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Verse 33, but he replied, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. Don't you worry, Jesus. I see that you're concerned about me failing. Don't you worry, not happening. Verse 34, Jesus answered, Peter, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times, that you know me. So something's going on here. Jesus is alluding to future failure. Peter is in present confidence, and Jesus is speaking to future failure. So it's like future from Jesus, present from Peter, future from Jesus. Sounds good. I mean, I would love to think that we're like, no, wait, Jesus, I'm with you 100%. Let's go back and see if we can see the setup, because the setup really does shape the moment that Peter is so confident. This is verse 20. So he started at 31. Now we're going to go backwards to 20. In the same way, after the supper, this is the Last Supper. We've all heard this verse 1,000 times in our life. This is the story of communion. It's this deeply meaningful verse to our faith. It says, in the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, this is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. Okay. We know this. It's a very sacred moment when we take communion. You know, the blood and the body and the broken for you, that kind of stuff. It's like this very spiritually mature, reverent sort of moment. But the hand of him who is going to betray, this is the next verse. But the hand of him who's going to betray me is with mine on the table. He's saying, one of you that's going to betray me is at this table. The Son of Man will go as has been decreed, but woe to that man who betrays him. They began to question among themselves which of them it might be who would do this. It gets worse. Verse 24. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be considered the greatest. Can you imagine? This is 3 years into following Jesus, 3 years into his ministry, 3 years into service, 3 years into miracles, 3 years into dead people being raised, food being 3 years. Come right down to the Last Supper. This is the moment right before Jesus is going to go to the cross in crucifixion before resurrection. This is a very meaningful moment in the story of Jesus. And we've got betrayal happening and a competition virtue signaling amongst the disciples amongst who's the greatest. I feel like that would be a very frustrating meal. Here we get the Last Supper and the communion, but really what's taking place is like, what? So when Jesus is talking to Peter, and Jesus is like, which one of us can be the greatest? I guarantee you, Peter was in the argument. I just know his personality. You do too. He's this impulsive, impatient, but like everything is today. Everything is the present. And he's like, I guarantee you I'm the greatest, you guys. And they're like, no. He's like, you can just sense the temperature of the room. Jesus is giving communion-esque, some verses, and they're arguing over who's greatest. Oh, by the way, and betrayal. How? How does this happen? How does Jesus, right before the cross, have to deal with this out of his disciples? It makes so much more sense when you realize Jesus had started with the cross and resurrection and was working his way back. The disciples had no concept, it would seem, of the end at all. Their arguments were entirely about today. It was like they started with today. They woke up, they started with the problems of today, and they just reacted all day until bedtime, and then do it again the next day. You see the disciples living in a different timeline than Jesus. Jesus had started with the end and is working his way back. The disciples are arguing over who's the greatest right before the crucifixion. Your goals will tell you a lot. When you inventory your goals, it will tell you how much of your life is lived with a purpose versus how much of your life is lived in reaction. I prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Talking about the failure. But he replied, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. Present. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you'll deny me 3 times. Failure. Failure, no. Present, no. Future failure. Jesus is giving it to Peter on a silver platter, like, hey, you're headed towards pretty big failure. There's some pretty big screw-ups in your future. Peter said what all young, immature Christians might say. Not me, Jesus. I've searched my heart. Good news. What I've come up with, good stuff. There's some theory, and I can't stand behind this 100%, but the logic at least makes sense, that Judas, the betrayer, speaking of future failure, had some valiant goals. And I don't mean virtuous. I don't mean good. I don't mean that they were rooted in anything good. I just think that Judas saw himself as some sort of a hero. He really thought of himself as the good guy. I am the good guy. And anytime someone steals from you, they do it as, I deserve this. You can't steal from somebody without feeling superior to them. You would do what I did if you had, you're doing so good and you think, blah, 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 whatever excuse. The truth is, if you're going to steal from somebody, you have to feel superior to them first. I really believe that. Maybe there's some exceptions. I haven't really thought about that, but I think that's true. But at very least, if someone's going to steal from you, that the present outweighs the future. If you're someone who is a dishonest person, it's because the reaction of today outweighs the planning of tomorrow. But when you look at Judas specifically, yes, he had stolen from Jesus, sure. But I'm pretty sure that Judas's thing was power. I'm pretty confident that Judas saw himself as wanting to attach himself to something really spectacular, really wanted to stick it to the Romans. He really wanted to be this powerful figure. And this was the week that Jesus had been he rode in on a donkey, but forget that. They were throwing palm leaves at his feet. They were trying to elect him the king. And so Judas sees this and is like, now's the time. It's a perfect time. Like I said, it doesn't specifically say this, but the timeline makes sense that when someone is using Jesus versus following Jesus, they're opportunistic. True of all of us. I think at some point in our lives, we've all used Jesus. Ever heard somebody go, ever since I came to Jesus, things got worse. That's a good indication that you were using him, not following him. Because if we're following him, we expect hard times. If we're using him, we just want things to be better. All of a sudden, Jesus is useful to Judas's own personal agenda. And his goals, remember, take inventory of your goals. His goals allow him to play God and try to orchestrate a revolution. We're God's chosen people. Are we not? Are we not? We're the Israelites. We're God. We shouldn't be under the Romans. Am I right? His goals are to enact a revolution. And one of two things. Either Jesus isn't who he says he is, and let's get this charade over with, or Jesus is who he says he is, and this is going to go great. I'm forcing Jesus' hand. He's going to have to take out the Romans. It's a weird thing when we take inventory of our goals, what it says about who we believe Jesus to be. Jesus, the cross, the sacrifice, Jesus as the lamb versus Jesus as the lion, Jesus comes in as the sacrifice, was a very different end than what Judas had hoped for. Judas' story made sense to him because he saw it ending differently. Based on Judas's perceived end, when he takes inventory of his goals, they make more sense. 2, this is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. We're going to jump back to the Old Testament. We're going to jump all the way back to Genesis, but it's one of my favorite stories in the Bible because I feel like I've lived it in some sense. Inventory your goals. Second, if you're going to live from the end in mind, if you're going to go to death, if you're going to walk through the valley of dry bones and consider this is all going to end someday, what do I want to be true? And you start working your way back. Inventory your goals. Inventory your values. Take an inventory. Take a list. What are my values? What are the things when I look at my actions in my life? What does it tell me about my values? Genesis chapter 28, verse 10. Jacob had just finished deceiving his brother and tricking his dad, stealing the birthright. It was a shady deal. He was like the mama's boy. He didn't like going outside. And Esau is this hunter. When we think of hero, we think Esau is out and he's hunting and he's this rugged dude. And it says that Jacob, he's kind of this, I don't want to go outside, and like him and his mama's boy, and he's just tricked Esau, and now he's the villain. He has full on accepted the role of villain. Verse 10, Jacob left Beersheba. Why? Because he was afraid Esau was going to kill him. He had tricked his father, and he was out. I have to go survive. He was going back to the old family. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. Translated, it means that when Jacob had reached the middle of nowhere. When Jacob was fully in the middle of nowhere based on his own actions, running from his own consequences, running from his own choices, running from his own poor values, he was on the run for his life. He was an enemy of his brother because he had bad values. He tricked his father because he had bad values. He was now fully in self-preservation mode because he had bad values. Hey, side note, if you ever find yourself fully in self-preservation, nobody cares about me. I have to look out for myself. Me, victim. If you ever find yourself in full-on self-preservation mode, go back to the eulogy. Nobody wants their story to be, he just kind of looked out for himself all the time. He finds himself in a bad situation, but we would agree he kind of had earned it. Middle of nowhere, lays his head on the rock, and you know that he's thinking, I mean, there's something about even the most victim-y of victims. Victim-y, yes, Google it. The victim-y victims. Even the most wretched self-justifiers. There's a sense in every person when we've done something wrong that we kind of deserve our comeuppance. We don't want to admit it. We would never tell anybody that. We would never come right out and go, oh, I've earned it, but we feel it. And so as Jacob is getting ready to lay his head on the rock, you have to know that he's thinking like, I earned this discomfort. I deserve this. People go through this all the time when they screw up, and then they're like, oh, totally separate sermon, sidebar. I'll try to make this quick. When we follow God, he brings us through seasons of suffering. It's unavoidable. In fact, it's in the seasons of suffering that are some of the most rich, most fertile soil of our life. When we act like a screw up, we're going to go through seasons of suffering. The difference is, I think when we know that we've screwed up, we're like, we deserve it. We should have to stay here. When we're following God through seasons of suffering, we anticipate that it's going to get better. Okay. So he's laying his head on a stone. He's literally like, I guess I'll just go put my head on this rock. It's almost like an external behavior of like, I've been out here in the struggle in the desert. I guess I'll go put my head on a rock and cover myself up with a tree branch. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Lots there. There's a lot there, not for today. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Oh, great. Middle of nowhere. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and the east, to the north and the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until you have done what I have promised you. Recap. Jacob is dishonest. He screws everybody over. He's running for his life, and God says, I'm going to bless you. There are some things sometimes in the Bible that you read and you're like, what? Talk about an omega moment, the alpha omega, the beginning and the end. You know, God has the ability to see it from the end backwards. And so God is never confused where things are going. He knows. And so he has this moment where he gives Jacob a little bit of a glimpse. He doesn't tell him necessarily a timeline, but he goes, this is where it's headed. And I'm at work in your life. I'm at work in your story. And Jacob's like, but I'm the villain. He's like, I'm at work. I got this. But I'm the bad guy. I'm the rock, you know? Big omega moment. God gives Jacob a promise. When Jacob wakes up from the dream, this is right now, this is my favorite story in the Bible. This, at this point, is my favorite story in the Bible because I feel like that what Jacob says, I've said. I didn't say it in these words. I didn't know to. But I've used these same thoughts. I've thought these same thoughts. When Jacob wakes up, he says one of the most powerful lines in the entire Bible, one of the most meaningful moments. Listen, whether you're far from God, whether you're in church, whether you're at home, doesn't matter. Listen to this and see if we haven't. I think everybody goes through this. Jacob awoke from his sleep. He thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. God was here the whole time, but I didn't see it. I wasn't aware of it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate to heaven. He goes to sleep in isolation on a rock pillow of his own doing, his own screw-ups, his own mistakes, this life that he's made for himself, not thinking of the end, only thinking of the moment and being this self-absorbed person. And yet, he has this encounter with God. He thought he left God behind, or maybe he thought God had left him behind. And when he finds out that God is still active in his life, he's shocked. He goes, how? How is that possible? How is that possible? I've made a mess of my life. How many times have you said, I'll never be the same. I've screwed up. I can never make it. I go to my eulogy, and what I realize is there's going to be a lot of more garbage than benefit there. There's going to be a lot more bad than good. I've made a mess of it. We expect God to be present in the churches. We expect that God's going to be present in the successes. We expect that God is present where there are heroes and good guys. We expect that. We feel God in nature. Anybody ever heard? Oh, I don't go to church. I sense that God's in nature. We sense that God is present in beauty. Nobody goes to the dregs of the earth and goes, I sense that God is here. When someone goes, I feel God in nature, it's usually like on top of a mountain where it's very easy to conceive that God would be. Jacob says, I am shocked to find out that God is also in the middle of nowhere, in seasons of failure, in deserts with villains. I'm shocked by this. I'm shocked to find out that the nature of God exists in places I didn't know to look for him. Listen to this. Almost this. If God is here, then God is not who I thought he was. Oh, what a powerful thought. What a powerful thought, that moment, that realization that goes, wait a minute, if God's here. I had a friend one time, I won't say names, but it's a recognizable couple of people. One of them anyway. And this guy's in the seminary studying to be a preacher, and his other friend is not. And so his other friend's driving, and he's got all the money, knows the truck. And so he whoops into a bar, and it's in a bad part of the neighborhood. And he's like, you going in? And this guy's studying to be a preacher. Like, no, man, I'm studying to be a minister. I can't go in a place like that. And so this other guy, he goes in. This other guy, he's telling me the story. He's in the bar, and he looks up, and pretty soon this guy that's studying to be in the seminary is like right here. He's like, hey, I thought you were studying to be a preacher. You couldn't come into a place like this. And this guy goes, hell couldn't be scarier than that parking lot. There are times where we know where to look for God, and there's times where we expect that God wouldn't be. And I think there's such a interesting inventory of values. If we take inventory of our values, your values will tell you who you believe God to be. The reason it's important to take inventory of your values is your values will indicate who you believe God to be. And when you find out who he is, you might be shocked where he hangs out. You might be shocked the people that he chooses and uses and loves. Your eulogy may not yet be lost. Third, inventory your measurements. Inventory the way that you measure. I think it's interesting that comparison rules our culture. It rules our society, and the problem with comparison is it's a terrible measuring stick. Sometimes we need to take inventory of how we measure. I'm not going to lie, this third point, I learned it through Timothy Keller. It's weird that he's such a mentor in my life and doesn't even know how he exists. I'm good with it. It's fine. I don't care. But he talks about the older son, the prodigal God. In the book, The Prodigal God, he talks more about the older brother than the prodigal son. And it's an interesting study. Listen to this. Luke chapter 15, verse 25. We're going New Testament, Old Testament, back to New Testament. Now, his older son was in the field. The prodigal son ran off, sleeping with prostitutes, spent all of his money on terrible living, terrible decisions, gets broke, is feeding pigs, decides to go back to his father. His father runs out, meets him, hugs him, loves him, because sometimes the father doesn't act the way that we thought. We're shocked when we find out who our father really is, not who he is, who he is. I think you get it. The older son, he never left. He stayed there, diligently working, faithfully serving his father. Son comes back, they throw the son a party, older son, furious. It says, now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound. Theoretically, if the younger son had taken his inheritance and took off, then that meant the older son owned what? Whatever was left. So the father kills the fattened calf at the expense of, in theory, the older son, and it infuriates the older son. But he answered his father. He was angry and refused to go in. Father came out. Again, father pursuing son is not how it worked in the Eastern culture. This is not even close to how this story is supposed to play out. The father pursues the prodigal. Father goes out to meet the older son. He's angry, refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, sounds like two parents that get mad. Your kid. who has devoured your property with prostitutes. You killed a fattened calf for him. He mentions the mistakes, but he doesn't mention the restoration. Isn't that fascinating? He mentions the younger son's failures, but he doesn't mention that he'd come back. He just mentions, yeah. And he said to him, son, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad for your brother. He was dead, and now he's alive. Death, back to life. Ezekiel 37, back to life. He was lost, and now he's found. And it doesn't say anything about the older son. It doesn't say if the older son was like, oh, okay, I get it. It actually is possible that the prodigal son came back to the father at the expense of the older son who left the dad in anger. It doesn't say, but it doesn't clarify that it was redeemed. The older son saw himself as the hero of the story. He says so much. He goes, look at me. I have diligently served. I didn't run off. The younger son ran off and said, this is how I'll get what I want, but not me. I stayed, and I said, this is how I'll get what I want. The parallels are fascinating on that one. He saw the end, or the omega. He saw his story going differently. I would imagine if you were to say, what do you want, your eulogy to say? He'll be like, tell everybody I was the good one. Us versus them. In versus out. I draw my value from being better. He saw it going different. If I'm the good one, then with being good, I should get the reward of being good. Listen, I will fully admit I'm a trinket guy. If I'm going to do work, I like the reward. I'm just that way. Lacey, she's good at saving. Like, she likes to do goofy stuff like invest. Me, I'm like, I earned it. I want to go get the joy of spending it. There's a balance. We meet in the middle. The son feels like he did all the work, but he gets a different reward than the reward he was expecting. How many times do you think he went to bed at night patting himself on the back thinking about that other brother? I've earned my inheritance, not like him. Inventory our measurements means inventory how we measure what we earn, what we're owed, what we should expect, what the end, the beginning. I mean, the way that we measure is super important. Sometimes the way that we measure leaves us ungrateful for what we should be grateful for, unhappy in times we should be happy. Sometimes the way that we measure never lets us say enough or be grateful for what we have. It's interesting to me, there's a parallel there that the older brother, like Jacob, was surprised to find out that the father was in the middle of nowhere, loving people who had screwed up. Jacob was the recipient, the beneficiary of that moment. The older son felt like it came at his expense, but both were the recipient. One was able to see it, one wasn't. Social media, like I said, it's goofed up our measurements. It has completely destroyed how we measure. Here's why. Based on what I see on social media, you would think that someone dunking a basketball, it's normal. It just happens. You jump and you dunk it. Why? Because that's what we see. We see it all the time. The beauty standards in this country, what? And if we're not, as pretty as we'd like to be, we can edit it. The measurements of our our society are destroyed. And so what it does is it leaves us feeling like that we are less than, that we're ordinary and that ordinary is rare. And that is such a up is down, left is right. Like, we're living in, remember photos like the negatives where the black is white and the white is black? That we're so screwed up. Because then when we experience life, like Peter goes through this failure and he thinks he's the only one, we're left believing that our life is the only ordinary. Everybody else's life is so amazing. Why? Because we don't ever inventory the way that we measure. So when you're made aware of your shortcomings, when you see them, when you realize them, it leaves you feeling like you're isolated. You're the only one. You're the only one that battles the things that you go through. To believe that everybody else is getting it right, I will just use this stone as my pillow. Don't worry, God. You don't have to be nice to me. I don't deserve it. I'm not like everyone else that's perfect. But then the minute we get it right, we become the older brother and our measurements are screwed up. We're like, God, really, I deserve more than this. I've been doing good for 2 whole weeks. We don't measure according to the goals or the values that God's placed in our lives and in the word and in a teaching. And we measure ourselves based on our own values and our own goals. And then we can't figure out why society is so screwed up. Let's go back to Peter real quick. This is what ties the last 2 weeks together. This is the culmination of the 2 week series, and this is why I love this story so much. Remember at the Last Supper when Jesus warns Peter about his upcoming failure. He goes to the end and not the end, but later, and he tells Peter, he's like, "Hey, failure." Peter, living in the present, goes, "No way, not happening." Mark 16, "Don't be alarmed," he said. "Peter, you're headed towards some goof ups." "No way, not me." Jesus goes, "I'm living up here. You're living in what you see today. I know what's coming." I hope I can wrap this together. I hope this is going to make sense because there is a gem. There is value to the core of this verse. Verse 6 of Mark 16. There's a resurrection. Jesus had seen the cross. He had seen the resurrection. He had seen Peter's failure. He knew what was coming. None of this was a surprise. Peter was living in the present. All of it was a surprise. Verse 6, "Don't be alarmed." This is at the tomb. He's raised from the dead. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here." So the messenger is saying, like, no, this is what we said was going to happen, and it's happened. Listen to this. "But go tell his disciples," no detail is accidental. This was put in there specifically on purpose. This, like the author of this story wouldn't have thought to just include this detail. It's one of those that just proves the validity of the authenticity of the word, because it's a detail that once you see it, you go, oh, but a person making this story up wouldn't have thought to put this detail. It says, "But go tell his disciples and Peter." He specifically says, go make sure to tell Peter, yes, even him. Because now Peter, "No way, God, not me," lives through the experience that Jesus had already seen. It's news to Peter. It wasn't to Jesus. The end from the beginning, because Jesus had already seen the end, when he said to Peter, "Come follow me," it wasn't because he thought, and I feel like you're going to get it right. I feel like you're never going to face any scripts. I got a funny feeling you're going to be a real good disciple. Jesus calls Peter knowing of the screw up, knowing of the middle of nowhere. Jesus calls Peter knowing of the rock that would be a pillow. Jesus called you. When you didn't see your screw ups, he did. When you didn't anticipate the depths at which your decision making could take you, and now you're ashamed or frustrated, or worse yet, you think you're so inflated and so good that God, he saw it all. He, in a sense, think of this. He called Peter before Peter knew that he needed it. He says, "Go tell my disciples and Peter." Don't you think that Peter had that? Surely the Lord is in this place, even this place of failure. When Jesus restores Peter, you see it in the demeanor of Peter. Jesus was already in this place all the way back when I thought I was going to be good. Jesus was already in this place, and I was not aware of it. Oh, I love this. I love this so much, because it means as you take inventory of your goals, if you take inventory of your values, if you take inventory of your measurements, that means you start at the end. You go clear to Judgment Day and you look at Jesus when all of eternity is culminating in the moment. You're sitting there at the Judgment Day. You go, Jesus was in this place. There's no logic to giving up on the window of time. We're facing a suicide epidemic in this country because we don't see the end from the beginning. We think of ourselves as, different than what we'd hoped. We see ourselves, we thought we were going to be this, but we turned out to be that. And what we don't realize is God is in this place, and we weren't even aware of it. And if God is in the place of our screw-ups and our disasters and our mess-ups and our disappointments and our superiority and our virtue signaling, if God's in the middle of that, maybe he's not who we thought he was. Maybe God's got a vision for our life, for our time remaining between the end and now, and he wants to see death brought back into life, purpose and goals and things that we thought we'd given up on, the windows that we had closed. God's going, no, those are still open. You still got time. But I didn't know it was going to go this way. He's like, yeah, but I did. It says in the word, it says that he who began a good work in you is faithful. It doesn't say your faithfulness. It says his faithfulness draws you through to the completion. Sees the end, calls you today, and creates life out of the middle. Surely God is in this place. Surely God is in this place, the place where you're sitting, listening to this, considering whether this could be true or not. Surely God is even in this place, and we were not aware of it. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that you would help us to inventory our lives, inventory our goals, our values, and our measurements. And God, start from the end, go to the eulogy, go to the end, and work our way back. God, help us to see the value in our remaining time. No matter how much of a mess we've made, there is time to live out life out of death, to live life and beauty and purpose and passion and art and relationships and the joy that comes with being alive. There is time left to begin living in those things, that you were in this place and we were not aware of it. God, in the same way that the disciples lived so in the present that they got it wrong, even in the presence of Jesus, God, I pray that you would give us that Peter being restored to you moment where we realize it's not because we were so good. It was not because we'd earned it. We're not like the older brother who deserves everything. God, we are the recipients of a wild grace, a wild, wild mercy that comes for us and sees us where we are and redeems us back, restores us back as we walk through the valley of dry bones this morning, that there's still life left to live. God, give us a vision for a life of purpose and passion. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.